I'm Richard Brown, and I'm a reader in modern literature in the School of English at the University of Leeds. And much of my work is about modern literature and, consequently, the modern novel. Now, I sometimes get asked by students, and even by interested people outside the university, very basic questions about reading novels. How do you read a novel, they might ask. What they might really mean to ask is, how do you read a novel professionally, as an academic critic or as a literary intellectual? What does it mean to read a novel as an expert on novels? After all, isn't reading a novel something we can all do, at least all of us who can read? And if we can read, then don't we already know what it's about? Well, one way to get beyond this very basic level is to begin by asking the examiners what they see as the most common weaknesses to be overcome. Typically, when they evaluate student essays and exam performance on novels, academic critics and teachers of literature tend to comment that the weaker efforts rely too much on simple or literal description of content, that they assume that novels are realistic, or assume that they too simply voice the supposed views of the author. Examiners complain that students write as if fictional characters are real people in the world, and that they don't write with enough awareness of narrative strategy and form. Reading such comments, we might be forgiven for thinking that it's much easier to say how not to read a novel than to say how to do it. All of these examiners would be quick to agree that there's no one single method for reading a novel. Yet most would also recognise that there are certain basic forms and figures through which all narrative prose writing operates, and that approaching these can provide readers with a set of tools with which to unpick narrative prose strategy and effect, whatever our ultimate approach to a novel's meaning might be. And I'd like to keep strategy and effect in view for a moment here, and postpone questions of judgment and meaning as such by quoting from a famous modern novelistic practitioner, Virginia Woolf, who herself in 1926 wrote a lecture for schoolgirls with the title, How Should One Read a Book? In this lecture, she said, to read a book well, one should read it as if one were writing it. Begin not by sitting on the bench among the judges, but by standing in the dock with the criminal. Now, I like this comment, not so much because it takes attention away from the novel and back to the novelist. We've already seen that this might be a problem for some weaker readings. I like it because it encourages us to consider fictional production as a kind of creative production, novels as things that are made, and whose processes of manufacture we can appreciate and even participate in as readers. I also like it because Woolf's metaphor of the criminal in the dock makes us realise that writing's always a bit subversive, and that reading isn't necessarily a process of passive, obedient absorption, but can also be a disobedient, subversive, or even maybe in some sense, kind of criminal act. Now, in this first podcast, I'm going to suggest some very basic questions that we can ask a piece of narrative prose writing, questions that might bring us closer to the experience of the criminal in the dock that Woolf suggests, and more importantly still, lift us as self-conscious readers above some of those literalistic assumptions about reading novels that those examiners often complain about. They're questions that take us away from issues of content to issues of form, or if that distinction might seem a bit old-fashioned these days, then let's say away from those treacherous questions of what to all-important and more interesting questions of how. My questions focus not so much on the descriptive content of the narrative and on its characters as on the telling, and in particular, the important question in written prose narrative of who speaks or writes, who does the telling, that mysterious figure who's not necessarily either a character in the novel nor its author, but that fictional someone somewhere in between the actual author and the imagined characters who academic critics typically call the narrator. First of all then, let's ask some questions about narrative situation and voicing. Try to ask yourself who it is who's speaking or writing the narrative. Where are they supposed to be? When are they writing, and to whom? Such questions can quickly subdivide into many others. Is the narrator clearly a character with a name or personality, or else a more shadowy kind of depersonalised or objective voice, someone who apparently knows the story but isn't necessarily a part of it? Is it someone who might be or pretends to be the author of the book? And if the answer to this question is yes, then is this narrator figure really the same as the biographical author, or are they better seen as some kind of projected persona, and potentially someone quite different from the author, him or herself? One great example of a recent novel where the personality of the narrator is as important as the narrative is Kazuo Ishiguro's The Remains of the Day. Now we can ask, is the bulk of the story made up of narrative explanation or description in this narrator's voice, as often it is in 19th century novels of, say, George Eliot or Emily Bronte or Sir Walter Scott? Or is it, for example, built out of supposed letters or diaries, as it often was during the 18th century in the so-called epistolary works of writers such as Smollett or Richardson? Or is the narration made up of a mixture of these things, such as it is in Bram Stoker's famous Gothic novel Dracula? Or does it consist more, as in a drama, of dialogue, the direct speech of characters, such as in the comic novels of Evelyn Waugh? Is there a widespread use of the indirect speech of the characters, what they are said by the narrator to say? Or is the emphasis on their narrated or otherwise represented thought, as it is in many novels of the start of the 20th century, such as those by Joseph Conrad or Henry James? Or, again, is the narration composed of the interior monologue of the characters, as in some of the best-known parts of the work of James Joyce? We should then ask if the narrative is apparently objective, in the sense that it's equally reflective of the points of view or all or most of the characters. Or is it clearly oriented, as some specialist critics would say, focalised from a certain character's point of view? Does the narration work by taking on the style of a particular character, as is the case in novels by Gustave Flaubert? And finally, should we ask if these things are consistent throughout the novel, or do they change from chapter to chapter or section to section of the book, as the novelist employs a variety of narrative strategies for a range of expressive purposes in it? Novels, from Graham Swift's Last Orders to Jackie Kay's Trumpet, often have different chapters written from different characters' points of view. And in James Joyce's Ulysses, each of the 18 chapters or episodes represents an increasingly radical departure from the narrative style and strategy of the one that went before. Now, as a second area of questioning, I would want to ask about what we might call the syntax or the grammar of the narrative, which is after all bound to the grammar of language itself, especially the verbs, the action words, and their relatively limited range of options in terms of narrative person, first, second or third person, and tense, past, present or future. Each of these persons and tenses of narration may at least potentially be used by novelists, and in any combination, though admittedly some are used more often than others. Many readers assume that all narrative is written in third-person past tense form, made up of sentences such as he did this or she said that, but this is by no means always the case, not even for a novel which is set in the historical past. Tom McCarthy's 2010 Man Booker Prize shortlisted novel C is an example of a recent historical novel that uses the present tense narrative form throughout. On the other hand, it's well worth remembering here that many works of utopian fiction or science fiction, though they may be set at some supposed date in the future, still typically rely on past tense narration to make their invented worlds seem more grounded and real. This is because third-person past tense narrative form has certain distinctive effects. It can be ideal for creating a considered historical distance on events and for setting up a conversational bond between narrator and reader, such as we find in novels like Henry Fielding's Tom Jones or George Eliot's Middlemarch. Or else it can construct a superior kind of position from which the narrative can comment on its characters. Jane Austen's novels provide a really interesting example of this latter kind of fiction, where the artful third-person past-tense narration is eminently objective and economical, and yet at the same time generates a subtle, ironic commentary on the characters that invites the reader's judgment on them and subtly controls and directs the reader's attention and point of view. Novels that attempt to reveal a particular unique experience or perspective on events, or else the inner depth of a particular character, can very often rely heavily on first-person narration, and either the past or the present tense. Indeed, some critics might argue that this form of narration is the one that's really most distinctive of the novel form across its long history as a whole. A great example here from the 18th century, that great age of the rise of the novel form, would be Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, where the first person defines a unique experience of selfhood, which according to many critics becomes the novel's subsequent domain, right up to the extreme experience of interiority in the fictions of Samuel Beckett. The supposed autobiographicality of first-person narrative seems central to much novelist discourse, perhaps because it reassures readers by cleverly pretending that the voices of the narrator and character, and even of the narrator and the author, are one and the same, or at least closely aligned. This pretense, and it is a pretense, can be more or less effective. Compare, for example, the openings of Robinson Crusoe and Charles Dickens's autobiographical fiction Great Expectations, written some 140 years later. Here's Defoe. I was born in the year 1632 in the city of York, of a good family, though not of that country, my father being a foreigner of Bremen, who settled first at Hull. And this is Dickens. My family's name being Pirrip, and my Christian name Philip, my infant tongue could make of both names nothing longer or more explicit than Pip. So I called myself Pip, and came to be called Pip. Now these openings are similar, and yet also subtly different. They both immediately identify the narrator as the main character, and vice versa. If you think about it, though, there's a kind of awkwardness, an odd doubleness. For instance, in that phrase, my infant tongue, to which Dickens's narrator feels obliged to resort, as if to draw attention to the fact that there is a gap between the self who writes and the self who's written about here. Such doubleness is built deeply into the logic of first-person narration, but it can be quickly exposed if we compare these examples for a moment to James Joyce's much more stylistically radical, modernistic, autobiographical novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, written nearly 60 years later than Dickens, where the opening is pointedly conceived from within the presumed consciousness of the child protagonist himself. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road, and this moo cow that was coming down along the road met a nicens little boy named Baby Tuckoo. That opening, in which a child apparently hears a child's story in his own childish language, is clearly a lot more complex, and it explodes much of the previous decorum of narration, and puts an awareness of narrative strategy and form onto the agenda right away. Now, a third set of questions we may ask of novelistic form clusters around ideas of time. This can be an issue of contemporary, future or historical setting of a novel, but more subtly concerns the very foundations of its temporal structure. Since novels narrate events that take place in time, important aspects of their structure reveal themselves in the arrangement of sequence and chronology that's almost never a simple matter of one damn thing following after another, to invoke the cliché of Henry Ford on history. A narrative may more or less follow chronological order, but more typically does not do so, and employs instead any number of departures, concentrating, for example, at greater length on some moments in time, while skipping over others with little or no comment at all. Novels may sequence their events by more or less extravagant leaps forward or backwards in time, narrative prolepses, as they're called by some specialist critics, as opposed to analepses or flashbacks, as they're more familiarly known. The chronological scope of some novels consists in long family sagas across 2 or more generations, such as is the case with Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights or D.H. Lawrence's The Rainbow. On the other hand, another very interesting and popular form of narration can be found in single-day novels, sometimes called circadian fictions, which include Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway and James Joyce's Ulysses, and more recently Ian McEwan's novel Saturday. Once again, we can turn to the 18th century for a crucial example, Laurence Sterne's Tristram Shandy, whose long title promises to give an account of the life and opinions of its hero, brilliantly regresses from the moment of Tristram's birth into a labyrinthine speculation, or may not have happened at or before the moment of conception, between his parents and relatives and their friends, until the regressive digressions of the novel's structure itself become a main subject of its narration. Considered to be something of a worthless oddity in its own time, Tristram Shandy became a favourite work for later modernistic and postmodernist experimental writers. James Joyce's Ulysses itself contains a birthing chapter where the ostensible events may progress smoothly enough that the language of the narrative processes through a surreal carnival of parodied prose styles from the pre-English of the Roman occupation period through the history of subsequent English writing up to Joyce's present day. Hopscotch, the amazing experimental novel by Argentinian writer Julio Cortázar, whose work has been widely discussed since the 1960s, begins with the author's explanation that readers may read it in the conventional sequence starting at chapter 1, or else they may, if they prefer, follow a different sequence which is listed as beginning with chapter 73 and then zigzagging or hopscotching backwards and forwards in an alternative order. B.S. Johnson's The Unfortunates was a novel also published in the 1960s where the chapters were unbound and assorted in a box so that the reader could tackle them in any order they wished. Not all novels may be as self-consciously experimental as those by Cortázar and Johnson, but many consciously, and all in some way or another, must work with narrative, sequence and time. Martin Amis's first novel, The Rachel Papers, for example, chanced the countdown to its first-person narrator's 20th birthday. The chapters take place on different days, and in a precise sequence of times, progressing from 7 o'clock to 7:20 and 7:45, and they lead up to the midnight at the end of his teenage years. Now, fourthly, just as with time, the novel as a form plays with issues of represented space. Spaces large and small, exterior and interior, domestic and public, actual or imagined. Classically, the novelist loves to place action in borderline or so-called liminal spaces, such as windows and doors that frame the action or suggest crises or transitions. J.G. Ballard, noted as science fiction author, and as an author associated with the strangely inhuman airport and motorway spaces of modern urban geography, nevertheless defines his true imaginative territory as what he calls inner space. The novel is in some respects the literary form which can most achieve a fidelity to actual spaces observed in the present or recreated from the past. Its urban realism is often celebrated in this vein, but it's also a form in which the spaces can be fantastically invented. The fantastical spaces of Tolkien's fiction, for example, or of the Harry Potter novels, are in some sense as real as the urban locations of Dickens or of Joyce. These days, how the novel relates to its represented spaces can be a key theme in discussing the contemporary internationalising of the novel as a form. Whether, for example, its spaces are imagined from the perspective of the colonial explorer, or that of the traveller or tourist, or else that of the native, can be a vitally important aspect of its narrative strategy and form. Space can be conflated with time, and in the work of the Soviet critic Mikhail Bakhtin, who wrote some of the most wide-ranging and suggestive criticism of the novel form that was written during the last century, the so-called chronotope, or time-space continuum of a work of fiction, is the thing that provides the key to exploring the boundaries and potential of its period and fictional genre. Now, I can maybe just manage briefly to suggest one last pair of questions that one might bring to the novel as a form. And those are questions of what the critic Roland Barthes called its cultural coding, and the reader response theorist Wolfgang Iser called its implied reader. A work of narrative may be said to operate not so much in terms of an external objective reality, which it represents by an act of simple naming, description or designation, but through a complex invocation of a series of codes, contexts, allusions and points of reference, which may speak to and assume a certain kind of reader. It may employ more or less critically or self-critically a range of assumptions and norms that are implicitly shared with this implied reader or community of readers, and these points of reference and more or less shared value or understanding can, if desired, be reconstructed or addressed by an actual reader, albeit through the activity of hard scholarly work and research. Echoes and allusions, whether to a play by Shakespeare or to a long-forgotten work of popular culture, are the stuff of fictional discourse, and they contribute as much to its sense of an imagined world as to descriptions of place or realism. They can also help us to sophisticate our sense of its meaning, which is what I want to discuss in the next podcast. What's more, an awareness of such codes can help take us beyond what might risk becoming another kind of problem for readers in the very formalism that may emerge from the approaches to form which I've outlined here, if taken on their own, in an excessively literal way or to an exaggerated extent. So let me conclude these brief remarks now with a reminder of my 5 sets of questions about 1. The narrative situation. 2. The narrative grammar, person and tense of narration. Number 3. The handling of sequence and time. Number 4. The representation of space. And finally, number 5. The novel's cultural coding and how it addresses an implied reader. Each of these sets of questions can help us approach the basics of novelistic form, and therefore treat the novel not so much in terms of what it contains, but in terms of how it works to produce its effects.